Martha Bennett slammed the bowl of stew onto the long pine table so hard the ladle bounced and broth sloshed over the rim. And then she stood there, all 30 years and 200 pounds of her chest, heaving eyes steady, staring at the 12 ranch hands who had spent 3 days making her life a quiet kind of hell. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the boots hit the floorboards behind her. Heavy, slow, deliberate. And Luke Carter's voice came low and dangerous from the kitchen doorway. "Who cooked this stew?" If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next in Black Pine Ranch will change the way you think about courage and about the kind of woman the world always underestimates. The wagon hit a rut in the mountain road, and Martha grabbed the sideboard with both hands, her worn leather satchel sliding off her lap and hitting the footboard with a dull thump. She picked it up without a word. The driver, a leathery man named Horace, who hadn't spoken more than 4 sentences since Pueblo, glanced sideways at her, and then looked away fast, the way people always did when they realized how long they'd been looking. She was used to it. She'd been used to it for 30 years. The Rocky Mountains rose around them like something out of a painting, spruce and pine packed so dense the midday light barely reached the road. Somewhere up ahead, past the next ridge and down through a long switchback valley, was Black Pine Ranch. She had the advertisement folded in her coat pocket. She'd read it so many times the creases had gone soft. Wanted ranch cook, must be experienced, must be reliable, must be willing to work in remote location. Inquire Black Pine Ranch, Harlan County, Colorado. No mention of wages. She'd written a letter anyway. A reply came back in 12 days, 2 lines in a cramped hand. Come on the 1st of August. Ask for Carter. That was the entirety of the arrangement. She had $35 sewn into the lining of her coat and a decade of kitchen work behind her hotel kitchens in St. Louis, a sanitarium kitchen in Jefferson City, where she'd fed 43 patients 3 meals a day without complaint. 2 years cooking for a family in Kansas City while their mother recovered from consumption. She knew how to stretch a ham bone into 3 days of meals. She knew how to keep bread from molding in a damp cellar. She knew that food, when it was made with any care at all, could do things for a sick person that medicine sometimes couldn't. What she did not know was what waited for her at the end of this road. Horace pulled the wagon through the gate, 2 rough pine poles with a crossbar, a burned brand in the wood that read BP, and the ranch came into view below them as the road curved down the hillside. She saw the main house first, a long, low structure of dark timber with a porch running the full length of the front. Behind it, a bunkhouse, a barn that needed paint, a chicken yard, a kitchen garden, gone half to weeds. Several horses in the far pasture. 2 or 3 men moving around the barn, though they stopped moving when the wagon appeared. By the time Horace pulled up to the main house, 6 of them were watching. She climbed down from the wagon herself before Horace could decide whether to help. She lifted her suitcase from the wagon bed, set it on the ground, and straightened her coat. One of the men near the porch, young, maybe 20, with ears too big for his face, said something under his breath to the man beside him. She heard the quiet laughter. She picked up her suitcase. A man came around the corner of the house and stopped at the edge of the porch. Tall, wide through the shoulders in the way of a man who'd worked outdoors since childhood. Dark hair gone a little long at the collar jaw, rough with several days of beard. He wore a plain work shirt and suspenders, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a delivery he wasn't entirely sure he'd ordered. "You the cook?" he said. "Martha Bennett," she said. "You Carter." "Luke Carter," he said. "Yeah." He didn't offer his hand. He looked at her suitcase, then at her, and something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Not cruelty, more like a man doing arithmetic in his head and coming out with an answer he wasn't sure about. "Kitchen's in the back," he said. "Attached to the main house. You'll have a room off it. Small." "Small is fine," she said. He turned and went back around the corner of the house without another word. She followed, carrying her own suitcase, past the young ranch hand with the big ears, who was still watching her, past two others who had stopped their work entirely to look. She kept her eyes forward and her face quiet. The kitchen was attached to the back of the main house by a short covered passage. She stepped inside and stood still for a moment, just taking it in. It was a disaster. Not dirty exactly, or not only dirty. It was a kitchen that had been used by people who didn't care about kitchens. Pots stacked wrong, so the heavy ones sat on top of the thin ones. Flour kept in an open sack on a low shelf where any moisture from the floor could reach it. A cutting board so deeply scored it couldn't be properly cleaned. Dried herbs, sage, rosemary. She thought she saw thyme tied in bundles and hung from the rafters, but half of them so old they'd lost everything useful about them. The iron stove was cold, and had been cold for some time. She could tell by the thick gray crust on the inside of the firebox door. She set her suitcase on the floor beside the door to her room, rolled up her sleeves, and went to find the woodpile. Nobody helped her. She didn't ask anyone to. She had a fire going in the stove within 20 minutes. She found the root cellar behind the kitchen, a low door in the hillside, and went down with a lantern to see what was there. Potatoes soft but not yet rotten. Half a barrel of dried beans. Onions, a good supply of them. Carrots still firm. Several jars of preserved tomatoes, a little dusty but sealed properly. She brought up what she needed and went back to the kitchen. Supper that first evening was a simple meal. She found a joint of beef hanging in the smokehouse. Not the best cut, the shank tough and sinewy. And she put it in the Dutch oven with the onions and carrots and a handful of dried herbs she'd sorted through until she found ones that still had some life in them. She let it cook slow for 3 hours while she remade the kitchen around it. She sorted the pots. She moved the flour into a proper tin with a lid. She scrubbed the cutting board with salt and a stiff brush until it was as clean as it was going to get. Supper at Black Pine Ranch was taken at a long table in the bunkhouse. She brought the food across in the Dutch oven and a basket of biscuits she'd managed to produce from what flour and lard she'd found. She set it on the table and stepped back. 9 ranch hands and Luke Carter sat down. An older man, very old, white-haired, moving with the careful slowness of someone whose body has begun to betray him, was helped to the table by a young Mexican boy, who Martha would later learn was called Tomas, though he was no boy, being perhaps 17 or 18. The old man was Samuel Carter, Luke's father. She knew this somehow without being told from the way Luke watched him settle into his chair. The men served themselves. She stood near the door. The young one with the big ears. His name turned out to be Clifton took a bite of the stew, and then he said loudly enough for the table to hear, "Ain't bad, for what it is." "What's that supposed to mean?" said the man beside him, a wiry redhead called Parrish. "Means it ain't bad," Clifton said, grinning. "Just surprised she could stir a pot without knocking the stove over." There was laughter. Not all of it, but some. Enough. Martha said nothing. She watched Samuel Carter lift his spoon. He ate slowly. He ate the way a man eats when eating has become a chore he no longer has the heart for. She watched him take the first spoon, then another, his white head bent over the bowl. He ate half the bowl before he stopped. At Black Pine Ranch, she would later learn, that was more than he'd eaten at a single sitting in 3 months. She went back to the kitchen and cleaned up. She didn't hear Luke Carter come in behind her until his voice came from the doorway. "My father ate tonight," he said. She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she still couldn't read. "I saw," she said. "He hasn't been eating much," Luke said, "since my mother passed." "When was that?" "For February." She nodded. "The stew wasn't complicated," she said, "but it was warm and it didn't fight him. Sometimes that's what a sick person needs. Food that doesn't fight them." Luke Carter looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded a single slow dip of his chin and walked out. That was the longest conversation they'd have for the next 2 weeks. She was methodical. That was the thing about Martha Bennett, that people, if they looked only at her shape and the worn state of her coat and the $35 sewn into her lining, entirely failed to see. She had a methodical mind that moved through problems the way water moves through rock. Not fast, not showy, but patient and persistent until it found the way through. The second morning she was up before anyone else, fire-going coffee ready. She had a notebook she'd bought in Pueblo, small brown cover, cheap paper, and she sat at the kitchen table before dawn and wrote out what she'd found in the root cellar, what she'd found in the smokehouse, what she estimated the household needed per week in the way of dry goods, and what that would cost at the nearest supply point, which was the town of Harlan, 12 miles down the mountain. She tore the page out and left it on the kitchen table where Luke would see it. He didn't say anything about it that day, but 2 days later, a supply wagon came back from Harlan with everything on the list. She didn't know if he'd noticed it was her list or thought it had always been there. She made a schedule. Breakfast at 5:30, biscuits, eggs, when there were enough side meat. Dinner at noon. The main meal always hot, always something that would carry a working man through an afternoon. Supper at 6, lighter, often a soup or a continuation of dinner. She posted the schedule on the kitchen wall and told Tomas, who had become her unofficial helper, without either of them exactly deciding, that to make sure the men knew when to come. By the end of the first week, Clifton had stopped making remarks in her presence. This wasn't because anyone told him to. It was because on day 4, after a dinner of salt pork and beans and cornbread that drew 3 men back for second helpings and caused old Hank, the longest tenured hand on the ranch, to say in his flat plainsman's way that it was the best beans he'd eaten outside his own mother's kitchen, Clifton had made another comment. Something about how at least a big woman was good for something, and Hank had turned and looked at him with those flat gray eyes and said, "You best finish your plate and keep your mouth to yourself, son." Clifton finished his plate. She was doing other things too. Things nobody asked her to do, and nobody told her were part of her job. She noticed that the pantry door stuck and that several jars of preserved goods had been shoved to the back of a low shelf because of it, where they'd been sitting long enough that the seals on 2 of them had failed. She got the door to open properly. It was a matter of the hinge. She trimmed the wood with a kitchen knife and reset the pin and moved everything forward where it could be seen and used. She noticed that Samuel Carter's room was at the back of the house, a room she passed through to access the cellar, and that the old man spent most of the day in a hard, straight-backed chair by the window, rather than in the worn armchair that sat in the corner of the parlor. She didn't say anything about this. She simply, one afternoon, when the house was empty, except for Samuel and herself, set a cup of strong, sweet tea on the windowsill beside him and left. The next day, she did the same. On the third day, she said from the doorway, "Mr. Carter, I could use another eye on the condition of that kitchen garden. When you have an inclination." He turned to look at her. His eyes were Luke's eyes, or Luke's were his dark blue and watchful. He said, "I ain't much use for gardens anymore." "That's all right," she said. "I'm not asking for use. I'm asking for another eye." He didn't come that day. He came the next morning, moving slow with his cane across the yard, and stood at the edge of the kitchen garden while she turned the earth around the remaining squash plants. They didn't talk much, but he came back the following morning, and the one after that. It was Tomas who told her in his quiet way that Samuel Carter had spent every morning in that garden until February, that it had been his wife's garden, and after she died, he'd stopped going near it. Martha filed that away and said nothing. She wasn't there to fix grief. She knew better than to think anyone could fix grief. She was only there to provide a reason to be outside on a morning and a cup of tea, and someone who didn't treat an old man like a problem to be solved. Meanwhile, the ranch hands were changing around her the way a room changes when you open a window that's been stuck shut. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But Parrish the redhead started lingering in the kitchen doorway on afternoons when he didn't have to be anywhere, asking about what she was making. He didn't really care about cooking, she suspected. He was one of those people who needed to be near activity and conversation, or he went restless. She put him to work shelling beans, and he talked the whole time, which was fine. She learned the names of every man on the ranch, their histories, who got along with whom, who had been there longest, who Luke trusted most. The man Luke trusted most was his ranch manager. His name was Dylan Marsh, and he'd been at Black Pine Ranch for 11 years, since before Samuel's decline, since before Luke's mother took sick. He was a compact, quiet man of about 45, with a neatness to him that stood out among the working hands. His collar was always straight, his ledger books always with him tucked under one arm, or sitting on the corner of whatever surface he was nearest. He had been with the Carters so long, he moved through the main house like he owned a piece of it. He was also the only person on the ranch who made Martha's instincts go still and flat and alert. She couldn't have said why at first. He was polite to her. Not warm, but polite. He said good morning when they passed in the kitchen passage, and he made no remarks about her size or her cooking. He acknowledged her the way a man acknowledges a piece of furniture that's been moved into a spot he finds neither helpful nor offensive. It was the ledger books that did it. She saw them first by accident. She'd been sent to the main house office by Luke. Sent was too strong a word. Luke Carter communicated in the direction of requests, rather than the fact of them, to find a paper. He needed a bill of sale for a horse transaction, which he described as being in the left-hand desk drawer under the survey maps. She found the bill of sale. She also noticed, because she had the kind of eyes that noticed things, that the stack of ledger books on the corner of the desk was arranged in a specific order, specific enough that she could see 2 of them had been placed there recently. Their spines not yet faded the way the others were, their corners still sharp. She didn't touch them. She took the bill of sale and went back to the kitchen. But she thought about it. She thought about it the way she thought about the pantry door, about Samuel's garden chair, about the flour left in an open sack. There was something that didn't fit, and the things that didn't fit were always worth understanding. It was Hank who gave her the first piece, though he didn't know he was giving it to her. He came in for coffee one evening late, and he was in the tired talking state that men get into when they've been working long, and the day has worn something loose in them. He sat at the kitchen table, and she poured his coffee, and he said, looking at nothing in particular, 40 head we moved down from the high pasture last week, 40 head. That's a lot of moving, she said. Yeah, he said. And now Marsh says the tally's 32. She said nothing. She refilled his cup. Cattle don't disappear, Hank said to his coffee to the wall. Not 40 head numbers of them. They die, or they sell, or they walk off a ridge. They don't just come up short on paper. Have you said anything to Carter? She asked. Hank looked at her. He looked at her a long time. Marsh does the books, he said finally. And that was all he said. Martha thought about this for 3 days before she did anything. She was not an impulsive woman. She had learned over 30 years that impulsive women were dismissed faster than any other kind, and that a woman who acted without certain footing was a woman who could be made to look foolish, and a woman who could be made to look foolish had no leverage at all. So she waited. She watched. She kept her eyes on Dylan Marsh the way she'd kept her eyes on the failing jars in the back of the pantry. Not fixedly, not visibly, just with the steady peripheral attention of someone who knows that the thing worth watching is usually the thing trying not to be watched. On the 18th day of her employment at Black Pine Ranch, she found the real ledger books. She hadn't been looking for them, not precisely. She'd gone to the root cellar for potatoes, a completely ordinary task on a completely ordinary Thursday morning. And the cellar door, when she pulled it open, didn't respond the way it usually did. It was heavier. Not much heavier, but enough. She went down with the lantern and found what she always found. The potatoes, the beans, the preserved jars, arranged on the plank shelves she'd reorganized her first week. She found the potatoes she'd come for. She also found, when she set the lantern down on the low shelf to free both hands for lifting, that the lantern's light fell at an angle that revealed a gap beneath the bottom shelf that shouldn't have been there. She got down on her knees. Not easy, and she didn't worry about it being easy. She had long since stopped organizing her life around what was easy, and she looked under the shelf. There was a flat tin box, the kind that held writing supplies, pushed back against the wall, and set on top of a folded piece of oilcloth. It wasn't dusty. It had been placed there recently enough that the dirt hadn't had time to settle on it the way the dirt settled on everything else down here. She put her hand in and drew it out. Inside were 3 ledger pages folded and a letter. She read them right there on her knees in the cellar with the lantern. The ledger pages showed numbers she recognized because she had over the past 18 days quietly noted what she could see of the ranch's actual production. How many eggs per week, how much beef had been processed, what the harvest from the kitchen garden had come in, at what the ranch hands said in their unguarded moments about how the season had gone. The numbers on these pages didn't match any of that. These numbers were smaller. Deliberately, consistently, specifically smaller. The letter was addressed to someone named Gideon Marsh, a brother she would later confirm at the offices of the Western Consolidated Cattle Company in Denver. It was dated 6 weeks ago, before Martha had arrived. It discussed in language that tried to be indirect and failed the progress of certain adjustments to the Black Pine accounts and the expectation that by the following spring, the property will be available for acquisition at the terms we discussed. She sat in the cellar for a long time. She thought about what she had. She thought about what it was worth and who it was worth it to. She thought about Dylan Marsh's straight collar and his ledger books always under his arm and his 11 years of being trusted. She thought about Luke Carter's face the night he'd come to tell her his father had eaten, and the way he'd looked, not like a man relieved, so much as a man surprised that anything good could still happen in this house. She thought about Samuel Carter standing at the edge of the kitchen garden in the early morning, leaning on his cane, watching her turn the earth. She thought about what would happen to all of it, the ranch, the old man, the hands who'd worked here for years, if the Western Consolidated Cattle Company got what it was working toward. She put the ledger pages and the letter back in the tin box. She put the tin box back where she'd found it in exactly the same position. She picked up her potatoes and her lantern and went back to the kitchen. She needed to understand more before she moved. She needed to understand all of it. Because when she moved, she was going to move once and she was going to move right, and there was not going to be any room for being wrong. That evening, she served supper as usual, a beef and potato hash, more biscuits, dried apple preserves, she'd found put up properly in the back of the cellar. The men ate. Clifton didn't make any remarks. Samuel ate most of his plate. Luke sat at the head of the table and looked as he often did, like a man carrying a weight that had become so familiar he'd forgotten it wasn't always there. Dylan Marsh ate neatly as always, and said something quiet and competent sounding to Luke about the week's schedule, and Luke nodded and Marsh finished his meal and excused himself to work on the accounts. Martha cleared the table and went to the kitchen. She set the tin basin in the washstand and poured hot water over the plates and stood there for a moment with her hands in the water, looking at nothing. Tomas came in with the last of the cups from the table and set them down beside her. He was quiet, the way young people are quiet when they sense the person they're near is thinking about something serious. He picked up a rag and started drying the plates she'd washed. "Tomas," she said, "you've been here 3 years." "Si," he said. 3 years this November." "In those 3 years," she said, "did the ranch ever have trouble with cattle counts? Numbers coming up short?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully, "Senor Marsh is very careful with the numbers." "I know he is," she said. "That's what I mean." Tomas dried 2 more plates. Then he said so quietly, she almost didn't catch it. "My cousin worked for a ranch outside of Alamosa. They had trouble with their numbers too, the same kind." He paused. "They lost the ranch." "Yes," Martha said. "I know." She washed the last cup. She handed it to Tomas to dry. Outside, through the kitchen window, the Colorado sky had gone the deep blue-black of altitude night, and the first stars were hard and cold and very bright above the ridgeline. She was going to need everything she could find, every number, every discrepancy, every piece of paper that didn't match what she knew to be true about this ranch and its actual production and its actual accounts. She was going to need time, and she was going to need to be invisible while she used it. Good thing she thought that she'd been practicing invisible her entire life. She dried her hands and hung the rag on the nail beside the washstand and went to her small room off the kitchen and took out her brown notebook and opened it to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote the date. Beneath it, she wrote, "What I know, what I can prove, what I need. And she began. The brown notebook was nearly half full by the end of the third week. Martha had developed a system. The kind of system that looks like nothing to anyone who glances at it, but means everything to the person who built it. She wrote in 2 columns. The left column was what Dylan Marsh's visible ledgers showed the numbers she'd managed to see when she brought coffee to the office and set it on the corner of the desk and let her eyes do their work while her hands stayed busy with something harmless. The right column was what she knew from the ranch itself, what Hank said in the kitchen, what Parrish let slip about how many calves had come through the spring, what the smokehouse inventory told her, what the feed consumption told her, because you could work backward from how much feed a herd ate to how many animals were eating it, and the numbers didn't lie if you knew how to read them. The gap between the 2 columns was not small. It was not an accounting error or a rounding habit or the kind of slippage that happens when a man is careless. It was precise. It was intentional. And it had been going on for long enough that the accumulated difference when she added it up in the margin of page 14 with her stub of pencil and her careful arithmetic came to something that made her sit very still at the kitchen table in the dark of 4 in the morning and breathe through it. 3 years. She estimated at least 3 years of it, possibly longer. She closed the notebook and she went and stoked the stove and she started the breakfast biscuits because there was nothing she could do at 4 in the morning except keep working, and keeping working was the only thing that had ever kept her sane. It was Parrish who brought her the next piece a week later, though he didn't know he was doing it. He'd come in for his afternoon coffee. He was the only ranch hand who drank coffee in the afternoon, which was how Martha had learned to always have a pot ready past noon, and he was in one of his talking moods, which meant he sat at the table and talked at whoever would hold still long enough. And today, that was Martha who was rolling pie crust and listening with the part of her mind she kept permanently open for things that mattered. "Heard something in Harlan yesterday," Parrish said, wrapping both hands around his mug. She said. "Couple of men in the feed store. Didn't know I was behind the barrel stack." He paused the way people pause when they're deciding whether to say the real thing or the safe version of the real thing. They were talking about black pine. She didn't look up from the pastry. "What about it?" "Talking like it was already sold," Parrish said. "Like it was a matter of when, not if." He watched her hands on the rolling pin. "One of them said something about a company out of Denver. Western something." "Western Consolidated," Martha said. She said it before she'd decided to say it, which was not like her. She looked up then and found Parrish staring at her. "How do you know that name?" he said. She thought for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "Because I've heard it before, and because I think you should tell me everything those men said, and I think you should tell me right now." Parrish set his mug down. He wasn't a particularly serious man, but he was a fundamentally decent one, and she'd watched him closely enough to know the difference. He leaned forward on the table. "They said Black Pine was carrying debt it couldn't cover," he said. "Said the Carter family would have to sell by spring, or the bank would move on them." He stopped. "But Luke's never said anything about debt. And I've been here 4 years. I know what this place earns." "I know what it earns too," Martha said. "And you're right. There shouldn't be debt." They looked at each other across the kitchen table. "Miss Bennett," Parrish said slowly, "what exactly do you know?" "Not enough yet," she said, "but enough to know I need more time, and enough to know that nobody on this ranch should be saying anything to Marsh about any of this until I do." Parrish sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "You think it's Marsh?" She looked at him. "Lord," he said. He picked up his mug and drank the rest of his coffee in one long pull. Then he set it down and said very quietly, "What do you need?" What she needed was access to the full ledger books, the ones kept in the office, not the partial pages she'd found in the cellar. She needed to see the actual entries over the last 3 years side by side with what she'd reconstructed from the ranch's real production. And she needed to do it without Marsh knowing she'd done it. The opportunity came on a Thursday. Marsh rode to Harlan for the weekly banking, which he always did on Thursdays, which was one of the things about him that had struck her as unnecessarily regular. A man with nothing to hide didn't need to be quite so consistent. He left at 8 in the morning and didn't return until after supper. Luke had ridden out early to the east pasture with Hank and wouldn't be back until afternoon. Samuel was in the garden. Martha told Tomas she needed an hour in the house. Tomas looked at her. He said nothing. He nodded. She went into the office. She wasn't a woman who did things she hadn't thought through, so she'd thought through exactly this. She knew where the ledger books were on the corner of the desk, and in a locked drawer the key to which she had watched Marsh transfer from his vest pocket to the key rack beside the office door every single Thursday morning before he left, because a man carrying ledger books to a bank meeting didn't need the key to the drawer where the ledger books weren't. She used the key. She opened the drawer. She took out the ledger books and set them on the desk and opened her notebook to the pages she needed. She worked for 53 minutes. She was precise, and she was fast because she had no room to be slow. What she found confirmed everything she'd built in the right-hand column of her notes, and then it went further. There were entries she hadn't anticipated, transfers between accounts that didn't correspond to any legitimate ranch transaction. She could identify payments to a supply company in Denver that she was fairly certain had never delivered anything to Black Pine Ranch. The supply company's name was listed twice. The amount was not small. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it. She relocked the drawer. She hung the key where it lived. She went back to the kitchen and started the noon meal with steady hands and a mind that was working very fast in a very quiet way. She needed one more thing before she went to Luke. She needed to know whether Luke could hear it. She had watched Luke Carter for 3 weeks by then, and she had drawn her conclusions carefully the way she drew all her conclusions. He was a man who carried his grief like a second skin so habitual he'd stopped noticing it. His mother's death had not only taken his mother, it had taken the person who'd kept the center of this place warm and functional and human. And without that center, the ranch had started unraveling in ways that went past the financial. The men were competent but directionless. Samuel was disappearing into himself. And Luke, who was strong and capable and fundamentally decent in a way that his silence concealed Luke, was working himself into the ground every single day and calling it managing. He trusted Marsh because trust, once given the way Luke Carter gave it, did not lift easily, and because Marsh had been there before everything went wrong, which meant Marsh had become associated in Luke's mind with the time when things were right. She understood all of this. She also understood that telling him was going to be one of the hardest things she'd done in 30 years, and that how she told him mattered as much as what she told him. She decided to tell him that evening. She decided wrong. Because that afternoon, 2 hours before supper, Dylan Marsh came back from Harlan 3 hours early, and he came straight to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway. He was always neat, but today there was something off in his neatness, something tight around the eyes, and careful about the way he held himself. "Miss Bennett," he said. She turned from the stove. "Mr. Marsh, you're back early." "I am," he said. He came into the kitchen, which he did not usually do. He stopped at the table and set his hands on the back of a chair. "I heard something in Harlan today that concerned me." She waited. "Seems there's been some questions," he said, "about the ranch accounts, from people who have no business asking questions about them." She kept her face the way she kept her face in difficult moments, open, attentive, neutral. "Questions from who? I don't know yet," he said, "but I intend to find out." He looked at her steadily. "You haven't had occasion to discuss ranch business with anyone in town, have you?" "I haven't been to town," she said. "I don't have a way to town." "No," he said. "You don't." He held her eyes for a moment longer than was natural. Then he picked up his hands from the chair and straightened his collar, which didn't need straightening, and said, "Of course. My mistake. Good evening, Miss Bennett." He walked out. She turned back to the stove and stood there with her heart hitting the inside of her chest at a rate she found unprofessional. He didn't know. Not yet. But he was looking, which meant his instincts were working, and a man whose instincts were working was a man who would find what he was looking for eventually. She didn't have as much time as she'd thought. She went to find Luke. He was in the barn, which was where he went when the day's work was done, but he wasn't ready to stop moving. She found him with a brush, and one of the horses a gray mare, with a skeptical temperament. She stood in the barn doorway and waited until he looked up. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Not here. Somewhere Marsh won't walk past." Luke went still. He looked at her for a long moment. Something changed in his face. Not alarm, not yet, but the recognition of a serious person saying a serious thing. He set down the brush. "Come on," he said. He took her to the far end of the east pasture, where the fence met the tree line, and the sound wouldn't carry. He didn't say anything on the walk out there. Neither did she. When they stopped, he crossed his arms and looked at the mountains, and then he looked at her and said, "Tell me." So she told him. She told him all of it, from the first evening she'd noticed the flour sack sitting wrong to Hank's comment about the cattle tally to the tin box under the cellar shelf. She told him about the ledger books and what she'd found in them that morning. She kept her voice level and her words precise, because this was not a moment for emotion, her emotion, and she knew it. The facts were emotional enough on their own. Luke didn't interrupt. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he listened. His face went through things while she talked, a tightening around the eyes, a working of the muscle in his jaw, a stillness that got progressively more complete, and that she understood from watching him was not calm. It was the opposite of calm. It was a man holding himself very still because the alternative was something he couldn't afford. When she finished, he said nothing for almost a minute. Then he said 11 years. "Yes," she said. "He's been on this place for 11 years. Yes. My mother," he started. Then he stopped. Then he said, "My mother liked him. She trusted him with the household accounts the last 2 years she was sick." Martha said nothing. She let that sit where it needed to sit. Luke turned away. He took 3 steps toward the fence and put both hands on the top rail and stood there with his back to her, and she could see from the set of his shoulders exactly what was happening inside him. "Luke," she said. She didn't use his given name easily. This was only the second time. "I know what this feels like." He didn't turn around. "Do you?" "Like the ground went out from under you," she said. "Like everything you thought was solid turned out to be something you can't trust. And the worst part isn't the money. The worst part is what it says about your own judgment." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said without turning, "Why are you telling me this? This isn't your problem. You've been here less than a month." "Because it will be your father's problem," she said, "and yours, and Hank's and Parrish's and Tomas's. Because what Marsh is building toward will take everything with it when it falls." She paused. "And because I found it and I couldn't unknow it." Luke turned around. His face was under control now, the kind of control that costs a great deal to maintain, and he looked at her the way she thought he had been looking at her for weeks, without quite letting himself do it fully. Like a man who kept expecting a person to be less than they were, and kept being wrong. "What do you need me to do?" he said. She almost smiled. She kept it small. "Nothing yet," she said. "Not until I have everything. If we move too soon, he destroys what he can, and walks away clean, and the company still comes for the land, because the fake debt is on paper. I need 2 more weeks, and I need you to treat him exactly the same as you have been." Luke looked like he'd rather be asked to do nearly anything else. 2 weeks, he said. "Maybe less," she said. "But don't let him see anything change in your face." "Fine," he said. 2 weeks. And then, after a pause, "Miss Bennet." "Martha," she said. He blinked. It was small, barely there, but she caught it. "Martha," he said, "you've been taking a considerable risk. Whatever Marsh is protecting, it's not small." "No," she said, "it's not. If he figures out what you know, then I need to know it first," she said. "All of it. So there's nothing left to figure out." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded, and she nodded, and they walked back to the ranch in the blue early evening, and she went to the kitchen, and he went to wash up for supper, and Dylan Marsh was already at the table when they arrived, neat as ever, with his ledger book at his elbow. Martha served the meal. Her hands didn't shake. The next 10 days were the most demanding of her life, and her life had contained demanding years. She worked the kitchen with one hand, as it were, and the investigation with the other, and she could not let either one show the other to anyone who wasn't supposed to see it. She had Parrish now, and Parrish was more useful than he looked because he traveled to Harlan weekly, and he knew people there who would talk to a friendly face. She gave him 3 specific questions to ask, casual questions, the kind you could slide into a hardware store conversation without anyone marking them, and he came back 5 days later with the answers, which confirmed 2 things she'd suspected, and gave her one thing she hadn't expected. The unexpected thing was a name. The owner of the fictitious supply company in Denver was not, as she'd assumed, someone entirely outside the ranch's world. It was a brother-in-law of Dylan Marsh's, a man named Coulter, who had a Denver address and a record with the Territorial Land Office that Parrish's contact had described in the particular language of men who deal in land and know its shadows as considerable. She wrote it down on page 21 of the notebook. She underlined it. Samuel found her in the kitchen garden the following morning, sitting on the overturned crate she used as a stool when she weeded the lower beds, staring at nothing. "You're not weeding," he said. "No," she agreed. He lowered himself onto the bench she'd placed at the edge of the garden. Luke had built it at her suggestion, though he hadn't known it was her suggestion, and he set his cane across his knees. "Something's wrong," Samuel said. "I'm handling it," she said. "I didn't ask if you were handling it. I said something's wrong." He looked at her with those dark blue eyes that missed nothing, that had been watching everything from the porch for months and had seen more than anyone gave him credit for. "It's the ranch," he said. She looked at him. "I'm old," Samuel said. "Not blind. I've been watching this place go wrong for 2 years, and I didn't have the energy to stop it, and I told myself that was because I was grieving." He paused. "But that's not the whole truth." "Mr. Carter, the whole truth," he said, "is that I was ashamed, because I let it happen. I let things go that I should have been watching, and I know what that means." He looked at the garden. Eleanor would have seen it. My wife. She saw things about people. She always knew. He stopped for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "You're like her, the way you see things." Martha sat with that. "I'm trying to protect Luke," she said finally, "from losing what she and you built." Samuel nodded. He didn't say anything else. He just sat with her in the garden in the morning light, and that she found was enough. She put together the full document on day 11. She worked through the night to do it. 10 pages of her notebook, dense with numbers and dates and names, a clear accounting of the gap between what Marsh had recorded and what had actually happened on Black Pine Ranch for the last 3 years. She organized it the way she organized a kitchen. Everything in the right place. Nothing wasted, nothing unclear. She was copying the final page when she heard it. A sound from the passage between the kitchen and the main house. A floorboard. The specific 1/3 from the kitchen door that she knew had a creak. She knew it because she had memorized the sounds of this place, the way she memorized everything, not deliberately, but because her mind recorded what her survival instincts told it to keep. She closed the notebook. She set it in her lap under the edge of the table. The kitchen door opened. Dylan Marsh stood in the doorway. It was 2 a.m. He was fully dressed, which meant he had not been to bed, which meant he had been awake doing something, and the look on his face, careful, measuring a calculation, she could see him running behind his eyes, told her he had not come for water. "Miss Bennett," he said. "You're up late?" "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Making tomorrow's bread." She said it steadily, and she let her eyes go to the bowl of dough sitting on the far end of the table, which she'd started yesterday evening and left to rise overnight because she always started tomorrow's bread before she went to bed. There was no deliberate prop in this. It was just her life, and her life had its own useful consistencies. Marsh came into the kitchen. He looked at the bowl. He looked at the table. He looked at her hands, which were folded on the table's surface and empty. "I've been thinking," he said, "about something I noticed last week. A discrepancy in the supply ledger. Small, but it concerned me." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I wondered if in your organizing of the pantry you might have moved any papers, documents, receipts perhaps. I moved things that needed moving to make the kitchen work, she said. If I moved something that belonged to you, I'd be glad to help you find it. Nothing that belonged to me, he said smoothly. Ranch documents, things that might have been in the cellar perhaps for storage. She kept her face entirely open. I found potatoes in the cellar, she said, and preserved goods, and some old seed stock that had gone bad. She paused. I didn't move any documents. I wouldn't have known what to do with documents. He watched her. She looked back at him with the face she had been perfecting since she was 8 years old. The face that said she was a simple woman who cooked food and expected no trouble and had no interior life worth examining. After a long moment, Marsh stood up. He straightened his collar. Of course, he said. My mistake. He said it the same way he'd said it the last time, which meant it wasn't a mistake at all. It was a warning. Good night, Mr. Marsh, she said. He left. She waited until she heard the main house door close, and then she sat in the kitchen alone in the dark, and understood that she did not have 2 weeks. She did not have 1 week. She had at the outside 2 days before Dylan Marsh did something irreversible. She sat there for 60 seconds and let herself feel the full weight of it, because feeling it was not the same as being overcome by it, and she needed to know exactly how serious it was before she could decide how to move. Then she took the notebook from her lap, tucked it into the front of her apron, and went to wake up Luke Carter. She knocked on his door at 2:15 in the morning. She knocked quietly 4 times the way you knock when you need someone to wake without waking the house. There was a moment of silence, and then she heard him move, and then the door opened. He stood there in his work shirt and trousers, obviously not fully asleep, obviously also not surprised to see her. She thought his instincts had been telling him the same thing hers had. He knows, she said. Or he suspects enough. It's the same thing. Luke's jaw set. How long do we have? I don't know. Less than I thought. She handed him the notebook. This is everything. The numbers, the names, the company in Denver, the ledger entries, all of it. You need to read it tonight. He took it from her. There's a land attorney in Harlan, she said. Is he a man you trust? Clem Fowler, Luke said. I've known him 20 years. Then we need to be in his office when it opens tomorrow morning, she said. Before Marsh knows we're gone, before he has a chance to move anything or destroy anything. She paused. Can you get the real ledger books out of that locked drawer tonight without him hearing? Luke looked at her. It's my house, he said quietly. It's my drawer. Yes, she said. It is. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name exactly. It wasn't anger, or not only anger, it was something older and deeper than that. The thing that rises in a person when they understand fully for the first time what they have been robbed of. Not just money, not just land. The years of trust. The grief that had made him vulnerable. The deliberate targeting of a family at its lowest point. I'll have them, he said. Give me 10 minutes. She waited in the kitchen passage. She could hear through the walls the quiet, precise sounds of a man who knew his own house moving through it in the dark. She stood with her back to the wall and her hands quiet, and she breathed steadily, and she waited. Luke came back in 9 minutes with 3 ledger books under his arm, and a look on his face that she had not seen there before. It was not grief, and it was not calculation. It was something cleaner than either. Tomorrow morning, he said. Tomorrow morning, she said. She went back to her room. She did not sleep. By 5 o'clock she had breakfast going out of habit, because the ranch still had to eat, because Hank and Parrish and Tomas and the others still had work to do, and couldn't do it on empty stomachs, because this was still a working ranch, and she was still its cook, and that did not change because everything else was about to. She had the biscuits in the oven and the coffee going when she heard the main house door and the sound of boots she knew too well. Dylan Marsh walked into the kitchen at 5:20. He was fully dressed. He had his ledger book under his arm. His face was not the careful face of the night before. His face was the face of a man who has made a decision. "I'll need to speak with Carter this morning," he said, "before he rides out." "He's already up," Martha said, turning from the stove. "I believe he's in the barn." Marsh nodded. He turned to go. "Mr. Marsh," she said. He stopped. "The biscuits will be ready in 10 minutes if you want breakfast before you head out," she said. He turned and looked at her, and she looked back at him with her open, uncomplicated face. And she thought, "I am already 3 moves ahead of where you think I am, and by the time you figure out what is actually happening this morning, it will be finished." "Thank you," he said, and left. She turned back to the stove, and she let out a breath that she had been holding. It felt for 11 days. Luke was already gone. He'd ridden out 40 minutes ago quietly with Hank beside him, with 3 ledger books in his saddlebag and a notebook full of numbers and names and dates, headed for Harlan and the office of a land attorney named Clem Fowler. Martha pulled the biscuits from the oven. She set them on the rack to cool. She poured herself a cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun come up over the ridge in the particular way it came up in the Colorado mountains, sudden and golden and entirely indifferent to the business of the people below it. Somewhere in Harlan, in a few hours, Dylan Marsh's 11 years of careful theft was going to meet a land attorney and 3 ledger books and a notebook written by a woman nobody on this ranch had thought was worth watching. She sipped her coffee. She thought about Samuel in the garden. She thought about Tomas drying plates. She thought about Hank and his flat gray eyes, and the quiet way he'd said, "You best keep your mouth to yourself, son." She thought about Luke's face when he said, "It's my house. It's my drawer." She set down her cup and went to wake the ranch. There was still a day's work to be done, and she was not the kind of woman who let the day's work wait. Clem Fowler's office smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco, and the particular kind of dust that accumulates in a room where serious things get decided. Martha had never been inside it before. She sat in the straight-back chair across from the attorney's desk and watched him read through her notebook for the second time, his finger tracing the columns, his mouth doing the thing mouths do when the numbers they're reading are worse than expected. Luke sat beside her. He hadn't spoken in 4 minutes. She was counting. Fowler set the notebook down. He was a heavy-set man older than Luke by 20 years, with the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had learned early that speaking fast in a legal matter was how people ended up sorry. He looked at the ledger books stacked on the corner of his desk. He looked at Martha. "You built this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," she said. "From memory and observation. From memory, observation, and 11 nights with a pencil." Fowler looked at Luke. "She's right about the exposure. If this is what it appears to be, and I've been doing land law in this county for 31 years, and it appears to be exactly what it appears to be, then Western Consolidated has been positioning to acquire Black Pine under a fabricated debt structure for at minimum 3 years. He tapped the notebook. "This supply company in Denver, Coulter. Marsh's brother-in-law," Martha said. "I know who Coulter is," Fowler said, and something in his tone went flat in a way that made both of them look at him. He picked up his pipe and turned it in his hands without lighting it. "Coulter was involved in a similar arrangement with the Hendricks family outside Alamosa. 18 months ago. They lost their property." The room went quiet. Luke said, "The Hendricks lost their spread to Western Consolidated. Through a subsidiary," Fowler said. "Different name on the paperwork. Same pattern." He set the pipe down. "Luke, if Marsh moves to formalize this debt claim before we can file a counter-documentation, it becomes a legal entanglement that could take 2 years to unwind. You might keep the land at the end of it, but 2 years of legal fees would do what the fraud couldn't." "Then we move today," Luke said. "We move today," Fowler agreed. He looked at Martha again with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man revising his assessment of a situation mid-conversation. "Miss Bennett, I need you to write out a sworn statement. Everything you've told me in order with dates where you have them. Can you do that?" "I can do it right now," she said. Fowler pushed a clean sheet of paper across his desk and handed her his pen. She wrote for 22 minutes without stopping. Luke read it over her shoulder as she went. When she set the pen down, Fowler picked up the pages and read them standing, moving from one side of the office to the other, the way a man moves when his mind is working faster than his body knows what to do with. "All right," he said. "Here's what we do." He laid it out quickly and precisely. He'd file an emergency injunction against any debt transfer or property lien before close of business today, citing fraudulent accounting practices. He'd send a rider to Denver to the Territorial Land Office with copies of the ledger discrepancies. He had a contact at the Harlan County Sheriff's Office, a deputy named Briscoe, who'd worked land fraud cases before and who could be trusted to move quietly before moving officially. The critical piece, Fowler said, is the original ledger books, the ones in your office, Luke, the full set. If Marsh gets back to the ranch before we have those secured. "He won't," Luke said. Martha looked at him. "I have them," Luke said. He opened his saddlebag and laid 3 more ledger books on the desk, not the same 3 he'd brought in. These were older, their covers worn to softness, their spines cracked from years of use. "I went back in after you left this morning," he said to Martha. "Got the ones from the locked cabinet in the back of the office, the full set." She stared at him. "You went back in after we agreed." "After I thought about it," he said. "And after I thought about it, I decided that if Marsh came home early and I'd left evidence in the cabinet, we'd have nothing." He looked at her steadily. "So, I took everything." She wanted to say something to him about operating alone. She decided this was not the moment. She looked at Fowler instead. Fowler was already reaching for his coat. "Then we're in better shape than I thought," he said. "Let's get this filed." They were back on the road to Black Pine by noon. Fowler had been as good as his word, fast, precise, thorough, in the specific way of a man who has been waiting for this exact type of case for longer than he'd say out loud. The injunction was filed. Briscoe had been briefed. A rider was already heading for Denver. It should have felt like relief. Martha noticed that it didn't quite. It felt like the moment before a storm breaks, when the air goes still, and the animals go quiet, and you know something is coming, and you know you've done what you can, and you know that what you can do, and what the storm does, are 2 entirely different things. Luke rode beside her. He hadn't said much since they'd left Fowler's office. That was like him. The silence, but this silence had a different texture than his usual kind. "You went back in alone," she said. "I did." "That was a risk." "Yes," he said. "It was. You could have told me." He glanced at her. "I made a decision in the middle of the night," he said. "I didn't want to wake you twice. Luke." She said it with the particular weight she'd been developing for his name over the past weeks. "Don't manage what I can handle." He looked at her fully then, and something shifted in his face. "You're right," he said. "I won't." They rode in silence for a while. The mountain road curved up through the pines, and the horses moved steady, and somewhere behind them the machinery of a legal reckoning was beginning to turn. Then Luke said quietly, "My mother planted those roses by the front porch. I've been meaning to cut them back for 3 years. She didn't say anything. "She would have liked you," he said. Then he looked forward at the road and didn't say anything else. Martha kept her face forward too. But something in her chest shifted quiet as a door on a well-oiled hinge, opening onto something she hadn't expected to find here. They came over the last ridge and saw Black Pine below them, and they saw Dylan Marsh's horse tied outside the main house. Luke went still in the saddle. "He's back," Martha said. "He wasn't supposed to come back until evening." Luke's voice had gone to that particular quiet that preceded decision. "He went to Harlan." "And found out something sent him back fast," Martha said. They looked at each other. "Ride normal," she said. "Don't change anything in how you come in. Whatever he did in Harlan, he doesn't know what we did." "Not yet," Luke said. They rode down. Marsh was on the porch when they came through the gate. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he watched them come in with the careful, neutral expression of a man who is deciding in real time how to play the next 60 seconds. Luke dismounted and handed his reins to Tomas without looking away from Marsh. "Dylan," he said, "you're back early." "Had business finish faster than expected," Marsh said. "We need to talk." "All right," Luke said. "Come inside." "Alone," Marsh said. His eyes moved to Martha as she dismounted. "Ranch business." "Miss Bennett stays," Luke said. He said it without emphasis, the way you state a fact about weather. He walked past Marsh and opened the front door. Marsh's jaw moved. He followed Luke inside. Martha followed Marsh. They went to the office. Marsh closed the door behind them. He turned to Luke with the ledger book already open in his hands, the visible one, the one he'd kept on the desk, and Martha watched his eyes go to the desk, and then to the cabinet in the back, and then to Luke's face. He didn't look at the desk long enough to know what was missing. Not yet. "I heard something in Harlan this morning," Marsh said, "about a filing with Fowler." Luke sat down behind the desk. He leaned back in the chair and crossed his arms, and he said, "What kind of filing?" "An injunction," Marsh said, "against debt transfer." He kept his voice level, but under the level there was something that wasn't level. "Now I don't know what you think you've found, Luke, but I need you to hear me out before—" "Before what?" Luke said. "Before you do something that damages this ranch further." Marsh set the ledger book on the desk and opened it to a page he'd marked. "These accounts are complex. I've been managing them for 11 years, and what looks like a discrepancy to someone who doesn't understand ranch accounting." "Doesn't understand ranch accounting," Luke repeated. "I'm not saying, Dylan." Luke's voice stayed quiet. That particular quiet that Martha had learned was more serious than shouting. "Don't." Marsh stopped. "Don't tell me what I don't understand about my own land," Luke said. "Don't tell me the books are complicated. Don't tell me you've been protecting the ranch." He looked at Marsh steadily. "I've read every entry. I've had every entry read by Clem Fowler. I know about Coulter. I know about the supply invoices. I know what Western Consolidated is expecting to purchase and when they're expecting to purchase it." The color in Marsh's face changed. "Luke," he said. "And I know about the Hendricks family," Luke said, "outside Alamosa." The silence in that room was absolute. Marsh stood very still. And then something in him, the neatness, the control, the 11 years of careful management slipped. Not dramatically, just by a fraction, just enough. "You don't have proof," he said. "You have suspicions and a cook's notebook and—" "We have the ledger books," Martha said. She said it from her position near the door where she'd been standing quietly. Both men looked at her. "The full set, including the ones from the locked cabinet." Marsh looked at the cabinet. His face, when he looked back, was a different face. The careful man was gone. What was underneath was older and harder and afraid men did things that neither helped them nor were predictable. "I don't know what you think," he started. "Sit down, Dylan," Luke said. "I'm not—" "Sit down." Marsh sat. "Deputy Briscoe will be here this afternoon," Luke said. "You can talk to him or not talk to him. That's your choice. But you're not leaving this ranch before he gets here." Marsh looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Martha. His eyes on her were not warm. "You," he said. "You've been here a month." 26 days, she said. 26 days, he said, and you decided to destroy something that took me 11 years to build. She held his gaze. "You destroyed it," she said. "I just found what was left." He stood up. He stood fast, the chair scraping back, and Luke was on his feet in the same second, and Martha took one step sideways toward the door without thinking about it, which put her between Marsh and the only way out. "Dylan," Luke said, very quiet. "Don't." Marsh stood there between the desk and the back wall, and Martha could see him running the numbers in his head, not accounting numbers, different numbers, worse ones, and she could see the moment he understood how they came out. He sat back down. The three of them stayed in that room, and nobody spoke. And outside the ranch went on with its ordinary afternoon sounds. Horses, somebody crossing the yard, Thomas calling something to Parrish in the distance, and everything sounded exactly the same as it always did. And everything was completely different. Briscoe arrived at 3:15. He was a younger man than Martha had expected, compact and quiet-spoken, with the particular kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. He came with two other men, which she also hadn't expected, and he shook Luke's hand on the porch and glanced at Martha with an expression that said, Fowler had told him about her already. "Miss Bennett," he said, "Attorney Fowler speaks well of your documentation." "I hope it's useful," she said. "It's more than useful," he said. "We've had our eye on Coulter for 14 months. What you've put together gives us the local piece we've been missing." He went inside. What happened next took 2 hours and was mostly paperwork and low voices through the office door, which Martha did not try to hear. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and brought it to the porch where Hank was sitting, because Hank had appeared there at some point in the last hour. Without explanation, the way a loyal old dog positions itself near trouble without being told. "How bad?" he said, taking the cup. "For Marsh bad," she said. "For the ranch I think it'll hold." Hank drank his coffee. "Been wrong about people before," he said. "It's a hell of a thing when it's someone you worked beside." "Yes," she said. "It is." They sat on the porch in silence. After a while, Samuel came around the side of the house, moving with his cane, and he saw Hank and Martha and the horses tied out front that weren't ranch horses, and he stopped. "Is it done?" he said. Martha looked at him. "Nearly." Samuel nodded. He came and lowered himself onto the bench beside the porch steps, and the three of them, the old rancher, the veteran hand. The cook from Missouri sat in the afternoon and waited. Marsh came out of the house an hour later with Briscoe on one side and his deputy on the other. He was not in handcuffs, but he walked the way a man walks when the thing that held him upright has been removed and he's discovering what's underneath. He didn't look at Hank. He didn't look at Samuel. He looked at Martha. She met his eyes. She didn't look away. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Briscoe paused on the porch steps and spoke to Luke for a few minutes in a low voice, and Luke listened with his arms crossed and his face still. Then Briscoe and his men and Dylan Marsh rode out through the gate, and Martha watched them until they were gone, and then she listened to the sound of the hoofbeats fade into the mountain distance until there was only the ranch again, and the wind, and the ordinary afternoon. Luke stood at the gate for a moment after they'd gone. Then he turned and walked back to the porch, and he looked at Martha, and he said, "It's done." "Not quite," she said. "Fowler still needs to file the counterclaim with the land office before Western Consolidated can respond. And they will respond." "I know," he said. "But that's law business. We've handed them what they need." He looked at her steadily. "You handed them what they need." "We," she said. He almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen him come close to it. Samuel from his bench said, "Someone going to tell me the whole story, or do I have to wait for supper?" Martha said, "I'll tell you over supper." She went to the kitchen. She had not been in the kitchen for 7 hours, and the state of it reflected this fact. She put things right with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom putting things right is as natural as breathing. And she started supper. And while she worked, she let her mind go through the events of the day. The way you run your hands over a piece of cloth you're checking for tears. Looking for what she'd missed. Looking for what still needed doing. Western Consolidated was not going to disappear quietly. She knew enough about organizations that operated the way this one operated to know that losing one instrument, one Dylan Marsh, was a setback, but not a defeat. They would respond through their attorneys. They would dispute the counter-documentation. They would move the timeline if they could. This was not over. Thomas came into the kitchen and looked around and began helping without being asked, which was what Thomas always did, and she was grateful for it, in the wordless way she'd become grateful for most things at Black Pine Ranch. "Is it over?" he said. "The worst part," she said. Not all of it. But the ranch is safe. She thought about that. The ranch is still standing, she said. Whether it's safe depends on what comes next. She looked at him. But I think it stands. I think it holds. Thomas nodded. He started on the bread without being told. It was almost 6 when Parrish appeared in the kitchen doorway, which was not unusual, and behind him was Clifton, which was unusual because Clifton had not voluntarily entered the kitchen since the first week. Parrish had the look of a man who has spent the afternoon gathering information from whatever sources became available, and is now prepared to deliver a report. "Heard Marsh is gone," Parrish said. "Yes," Martha said. "Heard it's because of—" He glanced at Clifton, then back at her. "Because of what you found." "What we found," she said. "Hank you, Luke. What I put together." Parrish was quiet for a moment. Then he said in his direct way, "Miss Bennett, I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "For the first week," he said. "I didn't say anything, but I laughed. When Clifton—" He gestured sideways. "Me too," Clifton said. "He said it to the floor, but he said it. I was ignorant and I'm sorry." She studied them both. Parrish met her eyes. Clifton mostly didn't, but he'd come, which took something she knew. "You've more than made up for it," she said to Parrish. "The things you found out in Harlan, that mattered." Parrish nodded. He seemed relieved in the way men get relieved when they've done a hard thing and it went better than they feared. "Supper's at 6, she said. "Both of you wash up." They left. Supper that night was the quietest and the loudest the bunkhouse table had been since she'd arrived. Quiet because everyone felt the weight of the day, the strange specific gravity of a thing you'd lived beside without knowing it being dragged out into the light. Loud because once the food was on the table and the first few minutes passed, Parrish started talking, and once Parrish started talking, the table came alive around him and the men ate and talked, and the ordinary living machinery of the ranch reasserted itself. Samuel ate the most she'd seen him eat at one sitting. He ate a full bowl of the beef stew she'd made, and a biscuit, and half of another, and he told her when she refilled his coffee that it was the best stew he'd had since his wife's. She said, "I'd very much like to know how she made hers." Samuel looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'll tell you what I remember." Luke at the head of the table was quiet, but present in a way he hadn't been before. Not the absence while present that grief produces, but actual presence, the kind that takes up space and warmth. He caught her eye once across the table, and he nodded just the one nod, the same one he'd given her that first night after Samuel had eaten. It meant the same thing it had meant then, only more. After supper, after the table was cleared, and the dishes were done, and the ranch settled toward night, she was still in the kitchen when the door opened and Luke came in. This was becoming a pattern. She noticed Luke appearing in the kitchen after the rest of the ranch had gone quiet. She thought he probably didn't notice he was doing it. He sat down at the kitchen table. He put his hands flat on the surface and looked at them. "I need to ask you something," he said. She dried the last cup and hung the rag. "Ask." "When you found the first ledger pages," he said, "in the cellar, you had every reason to walk away. You'd been here 3 weeks. You had no obligation." "No," she said. "So why didn't you—" She sat down across from him. She thought about how to answer that, not because she didn't know, but because the knowing of it was clearer than the saying of it. "Because Samuel was starting to eat again," she said. "Because Tomas was learning how to make bread properly. Because Hank said it was the best beans he'd had outside his mother's kitchen." She paused. "Because something was alive here that someone was trying to kill, and I knew how to stop it, and I've never been a woman who could see that and turn away." Luke looked at her. "And because," she said, "I've spent 30 years being the woman nobody thought was worth keeping. I thought maybe this was the place that would be different, and I didn't want to be wrong about that." He held her gaze for a long time. "You weren't wrong," he said. She nodded. She stood up. She went to the stove and checked the damper for the night, and she heard him push his chair back and stand. "Martha," he said. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen, this big, quiet, mountain-built man who carried his grief like weather and his honor like bone, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for weeks, and not quite letting himself do it. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it." She held his gaze. "You're welcome," she said, "for all of it." He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "I cut back those roses today," he said. "By the front porch. They needed it." She said nothing. She felt something tighten and loosen in her chest simultaneously. "They'll come back better in the spring," he said, and walked out. She stood in the kitchen alone. She set her hand flat on the table, the warm wood, the solid ordinary table she'd worked at every day for 26 days, and she breathed. Outside the Colorado, night was cold and clear and full of stars. The kind of stars you only see at altitude, brilliant and indifferent and permanent as the mountains themselves. Inside Black Pine Ranch, the fires were banked and the bread was set to rise, and the books that Dylan Marsh had falsified for 3 years were in Clem Fowler's office, and an injunction was filed, and a writer was in Denver. And in the morning, there would be biscuits and coffee and Samuel in the garden and work. There would be what came next with Western Consolidated, which would not be simple or fast. There would be the long business of rebuilding what 3 years of theft had taken. But tonight, the ranch was standing. Tonight, the thing that had been trying to die was still alive. She blew out the lamp. She went to her small room off the kitchen, the small room that had been small and was now hers, and she lay down, and for the first time in 11 days, she slept. She didn't know, not yet, that in Denver the writer had arrived at the Territorial Land Office. She didn't know that the name Coulter, connected now to 2 instances of the same scheme in the same region, had triggered the kind of attention from the territorial government that Coulter had spent years carefully avoiding. She didn't know that by morning there would be a telegram at Fowler's office that changed the shape of everything that came next. She only knew that the night was quiet, and the ranch was standing, and she had done what she came to do, and that tomorrow there was bread to bake, and a kitchen to run, and a story that was not finished. Not even close to finished. The telegram arrived at Fowler's office at 7:40 in the morning, and Luke was sitting across the desk from the attorney by 9, reading it for the 3rd time, with the expression of a man who has been hit by something he didn't see coming, but is choosing to remain standing anyway. Martha read it over his shoulder. The Territorial Land Office in Denver had not only received their rider, they had been waiting, as Briscoe had suggested the previous afternoon, for exactly this kind of documentation. The telegram confirmed that a formal investigation into Western Consolidated Cattle Company and its subsidiaries, including the supply company registered to one Harold Coulter, had been opened at the territorial level. The injunction Fowler had filed was not only accepted, but had been elevated. No debt transfer, no property lien, no foreclosure proceeding involving Black Pine Ranch could be executed until the investigation concluded. It should have been straightforward good news. Martha read it twice and felt the thing in it that Luke had also felt, the thing that made him read it 3 times. "They say the investigation could take 6 months, Luke said. "Yes," Fowler said. 6 months of the ranch operating under an open investigation. 6 months of the county knowing there was fraud connected to Black Pine. Luke set the telegram on the desk. "That does things to a man's credit, to his standing." "It does," Fowler said. He didn't try to soften it. Martha appreciated that about him. "It also means Western Consolidated can't touch you for those 6 months. And at the end of it, when Coulter and Marsh are prosecuted, and they will be prosecuted, Luke, what Miss Bennett documented is airtight. Your name comes out cleared, and theirs come out ruined." 6 months, Luke said again. "I know," Fowler said. Martha said, "What does the ranch actually owe? Legitimate debt, nothing fabricated." Fowler and Luke both looked at her. Fowler picked up a separate document and ran his finger down a column. "The spring cattle purchase. A loan against next season's beef contracts. Equipment from 2 years back." He added the numbers. He said the figure. It was not a small figure, but it was a real one, which made it a different kind of problem than the invented one. A problem with edges she could see, which meant a problem she could think about. "What does the ranch earn in a good season?" she asked Luke. Luke told her. "And this past season wasn't good because Marsh was skimming the receipts," she said. "But the actual production, the cattle, the contracts, that was intact." "The land's intact," Luke said. "The herd's intact. The contracts are intact." She nodded slowly. "Then you can service the real debt," she said. "It's tight, but it's manageable if you run lean for 2 seasons." "Running lean means some of the hands," Luke said. He said it with the weight of a man who knows what it means to tell people who depend on him that he can't keep them. "Not all of them," she said. "Hank stays. Thomas stays. You need Parrish for the Harlan runs. Clifton's useful with the horses." She had been running these numbers in her own head since 3 in the morning, which was when she had woken and known without understanding quite why that the telegram would say what it said and that the problem would be what it was. "And you need a cook." Luke looked at her. "I'm not asking for more wage," she said. "I'm saying a cook is not optional. You start sending ranch hands out without proper meals, and you lose them faster and to worse effect than if you'd let them go honestly." Fowler, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man watching something he hadn't expected to see in his office that morning, cleared his throat. "There's another consideration," he said. "The story of what Marsh did, it's going to get out. It's already getting out. Briscoe's not a gossip, but he's not invisible either, and in a county this size, a man getting escorted off a property by a deputy tends to generate conversation." "I know," Luke said. "The way the story gets told matters," Fowler said. "If it's told as Black Pine Ranch got defrauded and almost lost everything, that's one story. If it's told as Black Pine Ranch caught the fraud, documented it completely, and handed the territorial government the case they needed to shut down an operation that was victimizing ranches across the region." He spread his hands. "That's a different story." "How do we make sure it's told right?" Luke said. Fowler looked at Martha. She looked back at him. "I can talk to people," she said. "I've been talking to people since I got here. It's part of what I do." Luke said quietly, "That shouldn't be your job." "It's not a job," she said. "It's just true, and true things are easier to tell than complicated ones." She picked up the telegram and folded it precisely along its original creases. "Let me handle the town. You handle the ranch." Luke held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "All right." They rode back up the mountain in the late morning, and the arrangement between them, while it hadn't been said in so many words, had the solid, settled feeling of something that had been decided before either of them quite realized they were deciding it. Martha noticed this and filed it carefully in the part of herself that was not ready to examine it yet. What she was ready to examine was the problem of the next 6 months. She started that afternoon. The Harlan General Store was run by a woman named Ida Prescott, 63 years old, sharp as a new nail, and constitutionally incapable of receiving information without immediately redistributing it to every corner of the county. Martha had identified Ida as a key figure in the county's information ecosystem within her first week based on what Parrish had told her and what Tomas had confirmed, and what her own observation of Ida's position at the center of every supply transaction in the region had made obvious. She asked Luke if she could ride to Harlan with the supply wagon on Thursday. He said yes, without asking why, which she appreciated. Ida Prescott greeted her at the counter with the particular warmth of a woman who has heard something interesting and is hoping for more. "Miss Bennett," she said, "I heard there was some trouble up at Black Pine." "Some trouble that's been resolved," Martha said. She set her supply list on the counter and looked at Ida directly. "The ranch manager was defrauding the Carters for 3 years. We found it, documented it, and turned it over to Deputy Briscoe and the Territorial Land Office. It's being prosecuted." Ida stared at her. "The ranch itself is sound," Martha continued. "The herd's intact, the contracts are intact, the land's clear. There'll be an investigation period which is standard when fraud of this scale is involved, and at the end of it, Black Pine will have a clean record, and the men who were stealing from the Carter family will have the opposite." Ida said slowly, "Dylan Marsh." "Yes." 11 years. "Yes." Ida put both hands flat on the counter. Eleanor Carter, she said, and her voice went different. She and I went to school together. We were girls together. I stood at her wedding. She looked at Martha. You're telling me that man was stealing from her family while she was sick and dying? Yes, Martha said. That's what I'm telling you. The look on Ida Prescott's face was something Martha would not forget. It was grief and fury in equal measure, compressed into the face of a 63-year-old woman who had known Eleanor Carter since childhood, and it was the realest thing she'd seen in a long time. You found it, Ida said. I found it. Ida looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Your supply list. Let me see it. She filled every item on the list, and she gave Martha the county cooperative price on the dry goods, which was 10% below the standard retail, which she had no obligation to do, and which Martha did not mention and did not refuse. You tell Luke Carter, Ida said, as Martha was loading the wagon, that this county has not forgotten what his family built here. And you tell him that Ida Prescott said the story of what happened at Black Pine is going to be told right. I'll tell him, Martha said. She drove back up the mountain with a full wagon and the particular satisfaction of a woman who has placed the right piece in the right position and watched the larger structure adjust around it. The adjustment was visible within a week. Harlan was a small county, and a small county operates on trust, the way a ranch operates on water. It is the thing everything else depends on, and when it flows everywhere. And when it's redirected, the whole system responds. The story of Black Pine, as Ida Prescott told it, was not the story of a ranch that had been victimized. It was the story of a ranch that had caught its own fraud, documented it comprehensively, and handed the territory a case against a company that had been preying on Colorado ranches for years. The Hendricks family, hearing about it, sent a letter to Luke. They had lost their spread, but they had not stopped being angry about it, and they wanted to know what they could do. Fowler filed their testimonies as supporting documentation. Briscoe made 2 more arrests related to the Western Consolidated Operation men who had been facilitating the false invoicing out of Denver. Coulter retained an attorney and began the process of making everything as complicated as possible, which was expected and which Fowler had prepared for. In the middle of all this, Black Pine Ranch kept running. This was Martha's primary contribution to the following months, though she would not have described it that way. She would have said she was cooking. But what she was doing, what she had always been doing from the first evening she'd put that stew on the table, was maintaining the center. The thing that a working community needs in the same way it needs water and fire, and a roof that doesn't leak. The thing Eleanor Carter had provided, and whose absence had been quietly destroying the ranch for 6 months before Martha arrived. She maintained it practically. She kept the kitchen running on a budget that would have seemed impossible to anyone who didn't know how to make a soup bone last 3 days. She taught Tomas to bake bread with full competence, not just adequately, because teaching someone to do something well cost nothing, and bought resilience, and resilience was what the ranch needed. She organized the root cellar for winter with the kind of precision that meant the difference between a household that ate well in February and one that ran short in January. She maintained it humanly. She knew the names of every man's family back home. She knew Parrish had a sister in Kansas City he hadn't written in 8 months because he didn't know what to say. She knew Clifton's mother was sick, and that Clifton sent money home every month, and that it was never quite enough. She knew that Hank's silence was not unfriendliness, but the particular quiet of a man who had been working alone for so long that being around people required more from him than it should have. She didn't fix any of these things. She was not a woman who confused her role with a therapist's, but she noticed them, and noticing was different from nothing. And sometimes the difference between a man staying and a man leaving was whether someone in the place he was leaving had noticed him at all. The men noticed her noticing. They didn't say so. But the way a bunkhouse table changes over months, the way it gets louder, then more comfortable, then genuinely warm in a way that isn't noise but ease was the evidence, and she watched it and was satisfied by it, the way she was satisfied by bread that rose properly. Luke, meanwhile, was doing what Luke did, working, planning, making decisions, carrying things. She watched him find his footing in the changed ranch in the absence of Marsh, who had handled the accounting and the Harlan relationships and the correspondence with buyers. Luke absorbed all of it. He was capable of it. She'd known that from the first week, but capability and doing are different things. And doing takes time, and in the gap where the time was thin, she filled what she could fill without being asked and without drawing attention to the filling. He noticed. She knew he noticed because of the way he was around her, which was different from how he'd been in the beginning, not warmer exactly, or not only warmer, but more present, less inclined to manage the distance between them. It was 6 weeks after Marsh's departure that the first real crisis arrived, and it arrived not from Denver or the Territorial Land Office, but from a quarter she hadn't fully anticipated. 3 neighboring ranchers rode up to Black Pine on a Tuesday morning. She saw them from the kitchen window, horses she didn't recognize, men she didn't know by face. But something in the way they tied their horses and the set of their shoulders as they walked to the front porch made her wipe her hands on her apron and stand still. Luke went to meet them on the porch. She couldn't hear the conversation from the kitchen, but she could see his posture, and his posture went from open to careful within the first 30 seconds. Thomas appeared beside her. "Those are the Aldrich brothers," he said, "and Vernon Cole. They run the 3 ranches north of here." "I know the names," she said. "Parrish mentioned them." "They've been saying things in town," Thomas said carefully. She looked at him. "What kind of things?" "That the Carter family brought trouble to the county, that the investigation makes everyone look bad, that if Luke can't manage his own ranch manager, how can he be trusted to manage his range commitments?" Thomas paused. "Vernon Cole has been wanting the water rights on the East Creek for 5 years. Luke's father wouldn't sell." Martha dried her hands fully and untied her apron and hung it on the nail. "Put the kettle on," she said. "I'll be back." She went out the kitchen door and around to the front of the house. Luke heard her come around the corner and glanced at her, a quick involuntary glance that said he hadn't expected her and wasn't entirely sure about her timing. She positioned herself at the edge of the porch, not between Luke and the 3 men, not forward enough to appear to be speaking for him. Just present. The Aldrich brothers were the kind of men who filled a space with their size and their sound. Older one doing the talking, younger one reinforcing everything with his posture. Vernon Cole stood a little apart, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving. "Not about blame," the older Aldrich was saying. "But the fact is, Carter, your operation brought a territorial investigation into this county, and that's not nothing. The bank in Harlan is looking at all of us different now. The investigation is into Western Consolidated and Dillon Marsh," Luke said, "neither of which are county operations." "The association," Aldrich started, "is not affected by an investigation into a fraud that was perpetrated against Black Pine, not by it," Luke said. His voice was level. "I didn't bring trouble to this county. Dillon Marsh did, and the only reason that trouble is being dealt with properly, instead of eating 3 more ranches before it stopped, is because it was caught here." Cole, from his position slightly apart, said, "Caught by who exactly?" There was something in how he said it that made the older Aldrich glance at him. Martha felt it, the specific inflection that was not quite innocent. "Caught by my ranch," Luke said. "Caught by your cook," Cole said. He looked past Luke, then directly at Martha. "A woman nobody'd heard of who turned up 6 weeks before all this started and decided to go through the Carter family's private accounts." The porch went quiet. Luke said very quietly, "Careful." "I'm not being uncareful," Cole said. "I'm asking a reasonable question. Woman shows up month later, everything's in upheaval. You've got a territorial investigation. Your manager of 11 years is arrested." He spread his hands. "That's a pattern worth asking about." Martha said, "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Cole?" Cole looked at her. He had the expression of a man who expected a woman to look away first. "I'm not suggesting anything," he said. "I'm noting a coincidence." "You're suggesting I manufactured evidence against Dillon Marsh," she said. "Or perhaps that I had a prior relationship with Western Consolidated." Or perhaps that I orchestrated this entire sequence of events for some purpose you haven't quite worked out yet. She held his gaze. Which one is it? Because if you're going to accuse me of something, you should know what it is. Cole's jaw tightened. The notebook Miss Bennet kept, Luke said, and his voice had changed. It was the voice she'd heard in the office with Marsh, the quiet that was more serious than anything louder, was verified line by Clem Fowler. The discrepancies she documented matched the entries in ledger books that Marsh himself kept for 11 years. The supply company is registered to Marsh's brother-in-law. The Hendricks family has confirmed the same pattern was used against their ranch. He stopped. If you have a question about any of those facts, Fowler's office is in Harlan, and he'll see you. The older Aldrich shifted his weight. He looked at his brother, then at Cole, and Martha could see him doing the arithmetic of whether this conversation had been a good idea. Cole held for another moment. Then he said, "Nobody's making accusations, just asking questions." "Your questions have been answered," Luke said. "Anything else?" There was a pause. Then the older Aldrich said with the manner of a man trying to find the exit from a room he entered with more confidence than he'd been able to maintain. "We'll let Fowler sort it. That's all we came to say." "Glad to hear it," Luke said. They mounted up and rode out. Luke waited until they were through the gate, and then he turned and looked at Martha. She looked back at him. "Cole wants the East Creek water rights," she said. "He's wanted them for years." "He thought this was his opening," she said. "Cast doubt on how the fraud was found, cast doubt on the evidence, and if enough doubt sticks, maybe the investigation outcome is messier than it needs to be, and maybe Black Pine comes out of it weakened enough that Samuel reconsiders selling." "Samuel won't reconsider anything," Luke said. "I know," she said. "But Cole doesn't know that yet." She paused. "He'll try again, through different means." Luke looked at her for a long moment. "You walked out here on your own," he said. "Yes." "I didn't ask you to." "No." He was quiet. The horses at the rail were quiet. The ranch morning went on around them ordinary and steady. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't need me to," she said. "You were handling it." "I know," he said. "That's not why I'm thanking you." She understood what he meant. She nodded once and went back to the kitchen. The kettle had boiled. Tomas had made the tea without being asked. She poured 2 cups and brought one to the porch for Luke, who was still standing there looking at the gate, and she set it on the porch rail without a word and went back inside. Cole tried again 3 weeks later, and he did it more cleverly. He went to Ida Prescott. Martha found this out on the following Thursday supply run, when Ida pulled her to the back of the store with the directness of a woman who does not believe in wasting time on preamble. "Vernon Cole came in Monday," Ida said. "He spent 45 minutes in here, and the last 20 of them were about you." Martha felt something go still inside her. What did he say? He asked how much anyone really knew about you, where you came from, who you'd worked for. Ida looked at her directly. "He said he'd written to a hotel in St. Louis that you'd listed as a reference and gotten a letter back that raised questions." "What hotel?" Martha said. "The Planter's House," Ida said. Martha breathed out through her nose. "I worked at the Planter's House for 2 years, she said. "I left because the head cook and I disagreed about how the kitchen accounts were being managed. He was taking money from the supply budget. I told the manager. The head cook was let go and then rehired 6 months later when the manager changed. The letter Cole received was from the head cook." She paused. "His name is Arthur Billings. He has been telling the same story about me for 4 years." Ida looked at her for a long moment. "Cole is going to take that letter to people who don't know you," Martha said. "He's going to use it to suggest I have a pattern of making accusations against men in authority over accounts. He's going to use it to reopen the question of whether what I found at Black Pine was real." "Can he do damage with it?" Ida said. Martha thought about that honestly. "With the wrong people in the wrong moment, yes," she said. "The investigation is solid. Fowler says it's solid. But solid and finished are different things, and in the time between them enough doubt can do enough damage. Ida Prescott was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've known Arthur Billings's kind my entire life. Men who take what isn't theirs and then destroy the reputation of whoever caught them." She looked at Martha with Eleanor Carter's schoolgirl behind her eyes. "What do you need?" "I need someone to write to the Planters' house manager who was there when I was," Martha said. "His name is Edward Crane. He left St. Louis 2 years ago for a hotel in Cincinnati. I don't have his address." "I'll find it," Ida said. "And I need you to keep telling the story the right way," Martha said. "The true way, because Cole is going to work the county, and he's going to do it fast." "Let him try," Ida said. She found Crane's address in 4 days. Martha wrote the letter herself and gave it to Ida to send, because a letter sent through Ida Prescott arrived with the implicit endorsement of the woman sending it, which was not a small thing in Harlan County. The letter explained the situation at Black Pine, explained the letter Cole had obtained from Arthur Billings, and asked Crane to provide a factual account of the circumstances of Martha's departure from the Planters' house. Crane's reply came in 17 days. It was thorough. It was specific. It confirmed everything Martha had said about Billings and went further. Crane had, he wrote, become aware after his own departure that Billings had resumed his previous practices and that the Planters' house had faced significant losses as a result. He expressed deep regret that he had not acted more decisively when Martha brought the original situation to his attention, and said in the direct language of a man with a clear conscience that Martha Bennett was the most honest and capable kitchen manager he had worked with in 30 years of the hotel industry. Fowler used the letter. He didn't need to use it in court. It didn't come to that. Not for Martha specifically, but he used it in the way legal professionals use things when they want a particular story to stop having legs. He showed it to Briscoe. Briscoe mentioned it in the particular way Briscoe mentioned things to the right people. Cole's version of Martha Bennett's history quietly stopped circulating. Cole himself did not give up. He wrote to the Territorial Land Office suggesting that the documentation provided by Black Pine should be independently reviewed given questions about its origin. The Territorial Land Office wrote back that the documentation had already been independently reviewed by multiple parties and was not in question. Cole's attorney sent a letter to Fowler suggesting that Mr. Cole would be willing to assist the Carter family with their financial difficulties by purchasing the East Creek water rights at fair market value. Fowler replied that the Carter family's financial situation was not such that any sale of water rights was being considered. Martha was in Fowler's office when he drafted that particular reply. She read it over his shoulder and thought it was exactly right. "He'll try once more," she said, "and then he'll stop." "What makes you think so?" Fowler said. "Because men like that have a calculation," she said. "At some point the cost of trying exceeds the value of what they're trying for. We've made each attempt more expensive than the last. At some point his own arithmetic tells him to stop." Fowler looked at her. "You think like a lawyer," he said. "I think like someone who's had to," she said. She was right about Cole. He made one more attempt at conversation at the Cattlemen's Association meeting in Harlan, in which he tried to raise questions about the water rights situation, and was met with a collective indifference from men who had heard Ida Prescott's version of events, and Hank's version of events, and Parrish's version of events, which between them constituted the complete and verified story of what had happened at Black Pine, and who had no interest in Vernon Cole's version. After that, Cole tipped his hat to Luke at the feed store and said nothing further. Luke told her about it that evening at the kitchen table, in what had become their end-of-day habit. Not formal, never formally established, just a time when the ranch was quiet and the day's accounting happened between them. He told her with something in his face that she thought might be the beginnings of ease. Not full ease, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but the beginning of it. The way a man's shoulders come down when he realizes the weight he's been bracing against has shifted. "Samuel walked the full length of the east fence this morning," Luke said. "With his cane, but without Thomas." "I know," she said. "He told me. He said he wanted to see how the fall calves were coming." "They're coming well?" she said. "Yeah." He looked at his coffee. "He hasn't done that in a year. Maybe longer. She waited. He said you told him about Eleanor's garden, Luke said. How the squash is coming up in the southwest corner. He said she always had trouble with the southwest corner. He told me about the drainage issue, Martha said. We fixed it. Luke looked up. You fixed it. Samuel told me what to do, she said. I moved the dirt. Luke held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at the table again, and he turned his coffee cup in his hands, and he said, My father hasn't talked about my mother in 7 months. Not directly. Not by name. She said nothing. He said her name this afternoon, Luke said. Standing at the east fence looking at the calves, he said her name, and he said she would have liked the fall this year. He stopped. His voice was entirely under control. He hasn't said her name since the funeral. Martha kept her hands around her own cup, and she looked at Luke Carter, and she understood fully and completely what it had cost him to tell her that. Not the words, the trust. The specific trust of a man who does not share easily telling something that mattered. She would have, Martha said. From what you and Samuel have told me, she would have loved this fall. Luke nodded once. He stood up and carried his cup to the washstand and rinsed it the way he'd learned to do, probably because he'd watched her do it every night, and it had become the natural end of the kitchen's day. At the door, he stopped. Martha, he said. She turned. I've been thinking, he said, about the spring. She waited. The ranch'll need more hands for the spring drive, he said. We'll be in better shape by then. The investigation should be wrapped. The debt schedule will be on track. He paused. I'll need to put proper arrangements in place, for everyone's positions. That makes sense, she said carefully. Including yours, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the door frame the way he looked at things when he was choosing words. What I mean, he said, is that I'd like your position here to be permanent, with proper wage reflecting what you actually do, which is considerably more than cook. He looked at her then. But I wanted to say that before spring. So you knew. So you weren't. He stopped. So I wasn't wondering, she finished. Yes, he said. She held his gaze. Something she'd been holding carefully for months shifted in her chest the way the ground shifts in spring thaw, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the irreversible quality of a thing that has been frozen beginning to move. All right, she said. He nodded. He turned to go. Luke, she said. He turned back. The roses by the front porch, she said. They're going to need to be brought in before the hard frost. He looked at her for a moment. The faintest thing moved across his face, not quite a smile. Something under the level of a smile, but related to one something she'd been watching for and had almost given up expecting. I'll take care of them, he said, and left. She sat at the kitchen table alone in the quiet of the late October evening, and she listened to the sounds of Black Pine Ranch settling toward night. The horses, the wind off the ridge, the creak of the bunkhouse where Parrish was probably talking, and Clifton was probably listening, and Hank was probably pretending to be asleep. Samuel's light still on in his room at the back of the house. She picked up her notebook from the table, the brown one, the cheap paper one she'd bought in Pueblo, with the last of her careful money. She turned it to the back pages past the columns of numbers and the names and the dates and the careful reconstruction of Dylan Marsh's theft. Past the page with Coulter's name underlined. Past the note she'd made in the cellar in the dark on her knees with the lantern. She found a blank page. At the top, she wrote the date. Beneath it, she wrote, what I have, what I've built, what comes next. And then she sat for a long time with the pencil in her hand and the blank page in front of her, and for once she didn't write anything, because some things were not yet a list. Some things were still becoming. Outside, the Colorado night pressed cold against the kitchen window, and the stars were out in their altitude brilliance, and somewhere on the other side of the main house wall, she could hear just barely the sound of boots on the porch. Boards slow even the particular walk of a man who is going to see about some roses before the hard frost comes. The hard frost came on the 1st of November, exactly when Hank said it would, and the roses by the front porch came through it intact. Luke had brought them in himself, 3 evenings running, wrapping the canes in burlap, the way his mother had shown him when he was a boy, staking them against the wind. Martha watched him do it from the kitchen window on the second evening, and then looked away because some things were not meant to be watched too directly. The morning after the frost, Samuel came to the kitchen before breakfast and stood in the doorway with his cane and said without preamble, "Eleanor used to say those roses were the only thing on this property that required genuine patience." "They're worth it," Martha said. "Yes," he said. He came and sat at the table. "She was right about most things. It took me 20 years to fully appreciate that." He paused. "Don't tell Luke I said that. He'll think it's about him." "It is about him," Martha said. Samuel looked at her. Then something at the corner of his mouth shifted the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him, and he said, "Put extra sugar in that coffee, would you?" She put extra sugar in the coffee. This was November. The investigation was ongoing, but its outcome had in the way legal proceedings have become a known thing before it was an official thing. Fowler had told Luke in their October meeting that the territorial prosecutor was confident. Marsh had retained a lawyer, had made one attempt at a reduced cooperation arrangement, and had been turned down because the case against Western Consolidated needed his full testimony, not his negotiated version of it. Coulter had retained 2 lawyers and was making things complicated in the Denver courts, which Fowler described as predictable, and Briscoe described as a man spending money on a stall he couldn't hold. Black Pine Ranch ran lean as Martha had planned for. The kitchen budget was tight, and she made it work the way she made everything work, with precision and without complaint. She had extended the root cellar inventory further than she'd thought possible by putting up an additional 43 jars of preserved goods in October, using late-season vegetables from Samuel's kitchen garden that would otherwise have been lost to frost. Tomas had helped her do it in 2 long days. He was a better cook than he knew, and she had been telling him so regularly and specifically because people become what they are told they can be, and Tomas had been told too little for too long. Clifton had, in the quiet, unremarkable way of young men who grow up when no one is directly watching, become reliable. Not spectacular. She didn't think Clifton was built for spectacular, but solid in the way of a man who has decided to be solid. He'd taken over the wood supply for the kitchen without being asked, which meant the fire was never low, which meant she never lost an hour to green wood and a reluctant stove. She'd thanked him once. He'd turned red to the ears and said it wasn't nothing. She'd said she knew it wasn't, which was why she'd thanked him. Parrish had written to his sister in Kansas City. He told Martha this one afternoon over coffee, in the way he told things fast, slightly sideways, like he was commenting on someone else's business. "Wrote to Clara," he said, finally. "How long since you'd written?" she asked. 8 months. "What did she say?" "Haven't heard back yet." He drank his coffee. "But I sent it. That's the thing." "That's the thing," she agreed. She said all of this to no one, and to herself, and to the brown notebook in which she had resumed writing in November. Not numbers, this time, not evidence, but the ordinary record of a place coming back to itself. She did it because she had always written things down, because the habit of noticing was the habit of writing, because the notebook was where she put things she needed to keep. She put in it the date Samuel said Eleanor's name for the second time. The first had been at the east fence. The second was in the kitchen garden on a November morning when the last of the squash had been harvested, and the ground was iron cold, and he stood at the edge and said to the garden more than to Martha, "She'd have the garlic in by now. Eleanor always had it in before the ground froze." And then he'd looked at Martha and said, "You'd best get that garlic in." "Tell me where she planted it," Martha said. He told her. She planted it. She wrote that down in the notebook and drew a small map of where the garlic was. She didn't know why it felt important to write it down. She wrote it anyway. The first week of December brought 2 things. The first was a letter from the Territorial Prosecutor's Office confirming that Dylan Marsh had entered a full cooperation agreement and would be testifying against Western Consolidated in the new year. The fraud case was proceeding. The land claims were voided. Black Pine Ranch's counter-documentation had been formally accepted as the primary evidentiary foundation of the prosecution. The second thing was a visitor. She arrived on a Wednesday mid-morning in a hired wagon from Harlan. She was perhaps 55, well-dressed in the manner of a city woman making an effort toward practical, and she introduced herself to Luke on the porch as Mrs. Adelaide Cross, wife of Gerald Cross of the Colorado Cattlemen's Cooperative. Luke brought her inside. He sent Tomas to the kitchen to tell Martha she was needed. Martha came into the parlor with her hands still clean from bread making, which was the best she could do on short notice, and found Adelaide Cross sitting in the good chair with a traveling case on her knees and an expression of contained purpose. "Miss Bennett," Luke said. "Mrs. Cross is from the Cooperatives Board. We've been watching what happened here with considerable interest," Adelaide said. She had the direct manner of a woman who has learned that indirectness costs her more than it's worth. "My husband is on the board, but I do a significant portion of his correspondence, and I attend every meeting that will let me in the room." She paused. "The cooperative has 16-member ranches in this territory. 3 of them have experienced account irregularities in the last 4 years that they could not fully explain. After reviewing what your documentation showed about Western Consolidated's methods, we now believe at least 2 of those ranches were being worked by the same scheme." Martha sat down. "We want to know if you'd be willing to consult," Adelaide said. "On the accounting review, our cooperative's own books need to be examined by someone who knows what to look for, and I've spoken with Clem Fowler, and he told me—" She glanced at Luke, then back at Martha. "He told me you were the sharpest set of eyes he'd seen on a financial document in 30 years of practice." The room was quiet. Luke was looking at Martha. She could feel him looking. "I'm a ranch cook," Martha said. "You're a ranch cook," Adelaide agreed, who single-handedly reconstructed 3 years of fraudulent accounting from observation inference and 11 nights with a pencil. "Mr. Fowler showed me your notebook." She leaned forward slightly. "I would like to hire that person to look at 16 sets of ranch books and tell me what she finds." Martha looked at Luke. Luke said nothing. He kept his face entirely neutral, which she understood was his way of making sure whatever she decided was not influenced by what he wanted, which told her something about what he wanted. "I can't leave the ranch," she said. "I'm not asking you to leave the ranch," Adelaide said. "I'm asking for 4 days of your time in Harlan, where the cooperative meets in January. The records would come to you. Fowler would be present. My husband would be present." She paused. "You'd be compensated." She named a figure. Martha kept her face still. The figure was more than she earned at Black Pine in 3 months. "I'll need to discuss it," Martha said. "Of course," Adelaide said. Adelaide Cross had lunch at the Black Pine table that day, the full table, all the men, Samuel at his end. She was the kind of woman who adapted to a room Martha noticed, which was a skill worth more than most people recognized. She talked to Hank about cattle prices without condescension. She asked Thomas about the bread with genuine interest. She listened to Parrish's account of the Harlan feed store dispute with the patience of someone who understood that small things were usually about larger things. When she left after 2 hours, Samuel said from his end of the table, "She's a smart woman." "Yes," Martha said. "Going to take her up on it," Samuel said. Everyone at the table was carefully not looking at Martha, except Clifton, who was looking directly at her with the open curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned not to. "I think so," Martha said. She spoke to Luke that evening. She told him what she was thinking 4 days January Harlan. She'd prepare everything for the kitchen before she left. Tomas could manage. Luke listened. When she finished, he said, "You don't need my permission." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you because it affects the ranch." "The ranch will manage 4 days," he said. "I know that too," she said. And then, because she was 30 years old and had spent those years learning to say the necessary thing clearly, "I'm telling you because you matter to what I decide, and I thought you should know that." The kitchen was very quiet. Luke sat with that for a moment. He had his hands on the table the way he sat when he was letting something settle. "Go to Harlan," he said. "Do the work. Come back." "Come back," she repeated the way you repeat a thing when you need to hear it said again. Come back, he said. She went to Harlan in January. She was in Fowler's conference room for 4 days, and what she found in the cooperative's 16 sets of books was worse than she'd expected and more organized than she'd hoped. 2 ranches had been actively targeted by subsidiaries of Western Consolidated. 3 more showed irregularities that were either early-stage fraud or incompetent bookkeeping. She documented both possibilities and let Fowler determine which. The remaining 11 were clean or clean enough, and she told Adelaide Cross so directly because accuracy in both directions was the only thing worth doing. Her report was 41 pages. Fowler helped her organize it legally. Adelaide Cross read it twice in one sitting, and when she put it down, she looked at Martha across the conference table and said, "This will save at least 2 ranches." "I hope so," Martha said. "It will," Adelaide said. "I know these families. They didn't know what was happening to them." She paused. "You knew. In 3 weeks on a property you'd never seen you knew." "I've been paying attention my whole life," Martha said. "It has to be useful for something." Adelaide smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that changes a face entirely. "Come work for the cooperative," she said. "Formally. A proper position. You'd travel the territory, review accounts, consult on fraud prevention." Martha looked at her. "You could still be based at Black Pine," Adelaide said. "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to expand." Martha rode back up the mountain on the 5th day with 41 pages filed with the cooperative's attorney, a formal contract offer in her coat pocket, and a mind that was working at the careful speed it worked when the answer mattered, and she wasn't yet certain of it. She went to the kitchen first. She always went to the kitchen first. Tomas had managed better than managed. The bread was good, and the pantry was organized, and he'd correctly identified that the dried beans needed rotating and had done it without being told. She told him so. He stood straighter. Samuel found her in the garden before supper, which was where he found her when he wanted to talk without it looking like talking. "How was Harlan?" he said. "Productive," she said. She turned the cold earth around the garlic she'd planted where Eleanor had always planted it. "They offered me a position with the cooperative." Samuel was quiet. "It wouldn't require leaving," she said. "Not permanently. Some travel." "But some leaving," Samuel said. "Some leaving," she agreed. Samuel turned his cane in his hands. He looked at the garlic row. He said, "Eleanor left twice. Once before we married, she went to her sister's in Virginia for 3 months. Once after, when her mother was sick in St. Louis." He paused. "I didn't like either time." Martha said nothing. "But she came back better both times," Samuel said, knowing more of herself, more certain of what she'd chosen. He looked at Martha. A woman who knows what she's chosen is worth considerably more than a woman who stayed because she didn't know how to leave. She held his gaze. "Talk to Luke," Samuel said, and walked back to the house. She talked to Luke after supper. They were at the kitchen table where all the serious conversations happened, and she laid it out the way she laid everything out directly, completely, with nothing withheld. The contract, the travel, the compensation, which was significant, the meaning of it, the 2 ranches that could be saved, the patterns that could be stopped before they started. Luke listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "Do you want to do it?" She thought about that. The real answer, not the careful one. "Yes," she said. He nodded. "Luke, I know what you're going to ask," he said. She waited. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her fully directly the way he'd been working toward for months. "I'm going to ask you something first," he said. "And I want you to answer it straight because I'm not a man who asks things twice." "Ask," she said. "This place," he said. "Black Pine. Whatever you build with the cooperative, whatever you do in Harlan and Denver, wherever else they need you, do you want this to be the place you come back to?" She held his gaze. 30 years of being the woman nobody kept. 30 years of being looked through, looked past, looked at, and looked away from. And here was a man looking at her like she was the fixed point. Like she was the thing he was navigating by. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, Luke Carter did nothing dramatically, just with the steadiness that was the essential fact of him. His hand on hers on the kitchen table at the end of a January day, the stove warm, the ranch quiet around them. "Then go do the work," he said. "Come home when it's done." She turned her hand over and held his. "Ask me," she said. He understood. He looked at her with those dark blue eyes that were his father's eyes, that had been watching her since the first evening she'd set a bowl of beef stew on the table and changed the direction of everything. "Martha Bennett," he said. "Will you stay?" "I'll stay," she said. "And I'll go. And I'll come back." She held his hand. "That's the whole answer." "That's the whole answer," he said. They sat at the kitchen table, while the Colorado winter pressed against the walls, and the fire held, and the ranch breathed around them in its sleep. The spring came early that year. The garlic came up in the southwest corner of Eleanor's garden in March, strong and green exactly where it was supposed to be. Samuel saw it first and called to Martha from the garden, and she came out from the kitchen and stood beside him looking at it, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say that the garlic wasn't already saying. The territorial court handed down its ruling in March as well. Western Consolidated Cattle Company was found liable on 11 counts of fraudulent accounting, false debt structuring, and land acquisition through manufactured insolvency. Dillon Marsh received 5 years. Coulter received 7. The subsidiary companies were dissolved. The 2 Colorado ranches identified in Martha's cooperative report, the Burnett Spread and the Larkin family operation north of Pueblo, were both able to demonstrate that their apparent debts were fabricated, and both kept their land. Fowler sent the ruling to Black Pine by rider, which was how important things arrived. Luke read it on the porch and passed it to Martha without speaking. She read it and passed it to Samuel. Samuel read it and folded it precisely and handed it back to Luke and said, "File that where Eleanor kept the important papers." Luke said, "Where's that?" Samuel said, "Martha knows." She did know. Samuel had told her in November one of the mornings in the garden, in the way he told her things sideways, while ostensibly talking about something else. The important papers went in the tin box in the top left drawer of the roll-top desk, the one with the small brass pull. Eleanor had kept it that way for 40 years. Martha took the ruling from Luke and filed it where Eleanor kept the important papers. She was in Harlan twice more in the spring working for the cooperative. She was in Denver once for 3 days with Adelaide Cross and 2 cooperative attorneys presenting their fraud prevention framework to the Territorial Land Office. The Territorial Land Office adopted it. They called it the Bennett Review Protocol, which Martha told Adelaide was unnecessary, and Adelaide told Martha to stop arguing with free recognition. She came back from Denver on a Thursday. Luke met her wagon at the gate, which he did not usually do. She saw him standing there and understood without it needing to be said that he had been counting the days. She climbed down from the wagon. "How was Denver?" he said. "Effective," she said. "They adopted the protocol." He nodded. He took her bag. "Tomas burned the bread Tuesday," he said. "He told me," she said. "I'm going to show him what he did wrong." They walked up to the house side by side, and the ranch was exactly as she'd left it. Parrish crossing the yard, Clifton at the barn. Samuel's light already on in his room at the back, and also different in the specific way. Places are different when you have left them and returned and found them waiting, which is not the same as finding them unchanged. That evening after supper, after the kitchen was clean and the fire was banked, they sat at the kitchen table together as they always did, and Luke told her what had happened while she was gone. A fence down in the east pasture, a new calf from the gray mare. Hank's judgment about the spring grazing rotation, and she told him what had happened in Denver, and they sat in the warm kitchen and talked the way people talk when they trust each other completely, and have for long enough that they don't notice anymore that they're doing it. Later, when the house was quiet, Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt with his cane and an expression that said he'd been awake for reasons he wasn't going to explain. "She's back," he said to Luke. "She's back," Luke said. Samuel nodded, satisfied, as if this confirmed something he'd already decided. He looked at Martha. The southwest corner garlic will need thinning in 2 weeks, he said. I'll take care of it, she said. I know you will, he said, and went back to bed. Luke watched him go. Then he looked at Martha, and something in his face was so open and so unguarded that she understood she was seeing the version of him that existed before grief, the man underneath the weight, the man who had always been there, waiting for the weight to be worth carrying. He hasn't slept this well since before my mother got sick, he said. Good, she said. He reached across the table, and she took his hand, because this was what they did at the kitchen table at the end of the day, and neither of them felt any need to name it or explain it or hold it lightly. It was a solid thing. It had been built from solid materials, honesty and precision, and two people who chose each other not from need, but from recognition. 3 months later, on a June morning, when the mountain air was warm, and the kitchen garden was high and green, and the roses by the front porch had come back exactly as Luke had promised they would. Martha Bennett and Luke Carter stood on that porch in front of the people who had become their life. Samuel with his cane, Hank with his hat in his hands, Parrish grinning too wide, Clifton actually dressed properly for once, Thomas with bread he'd baked himself that morning, because Martha had told him he could, and they made the promises that serious people make when they have decided to build something together. Ida Prescott cried. She had driven 12 miles up the mountain, and she cried without apology. Adelaide Cross stood in the back and did not cry, but she pressed her lips together in a particular way that meant the same thing. Clem Fowler shook Luke's hand and said, "Your mother would have approved." And Luke said, "I know," and did not look away. Samuel Carter took Martha's hand after in both of his and held it for a moment and said nothing. He didn't need to. The man who had spent 6 months staring at the porch floor had Eleanor's roses at his back, and a kitchen that smelled like bread, and a table that had people at it again. And he looked at Martha Bennett Carter with eyes that said everything that needed saying. She squeezed his hands. She let go. She went to her kitchen. Thomas was already in it, and the bread was perfect, and the long table was set for more people than it had ever held before. Neighbors the Burnett family from south of Pueblo, who had driven 2 days to be there. 2 of the Hendricks children, Briscoe and his wife, and through the kitchen window she could hear the whole noise of it, the voices and the laughter and the boots on the porch boards, and the horses, and Luke's voice, somewhere in the middle of all of it, steady and present and home. She picked up the ladle. She served the stew. Outside the window, the Colorado summer held the mountain in its long gold light, and the roses were in bloom, and the garlic was in the ground, and Black Pine Ranch stood exactly as it had always stood. Not because it was the biggest or the richest or the most powerful operation in the territory, but because it had been built by people who understood that what you protect is never just the land. It's the warmth inside it. It's the table set, and the fire kept, and the bread made by someone who stayed, not because she had to, but because she looked at everything this place was trying to be, and decided that was worth being part of. Years later, travelers who stopped at Black Pine for a meal and a night's rest would ask the way travelers always asked about the famous stew. They had heard about it in Harlan. They had heard about it in Pueblo. They had heard somehow that it was the stew that saved the ranch. Luke would hear the question from the porch, and he would come inside, and he would pick up his coffee cup, and he would look at Martha across the kitchen, and he would smile the full one. The one that had taken months to arrive, and now arrived easily. And he would say to whoever was asking, "It wasn't the stew that saved us." And Martha, without looking up from the pot, would say, "Tell them the truth, Luke." And Luke would set down his cup and look at the traveler and say simply and finally, and with the complete certainty of a man who has held the real thing long enough to know its weight, "The woman who cooked it. She's the one who saved us. She walked in when everything was falling apart, and she saw what this place could be, and she stayed until it got there." The traveler would look at Martha. Martha would look up from the stew, and she would ladle another bowl and set it on the table and say, "Sit down and eat. It's better when it's hot." And it always was.